B.3.2. What kinds of property does the state protect? Kropotkin argued that the state was, open quote, the instrument for establishing monopolies in favor of the ruling minorities, end quote. In every system of class exploitation, a ruling class controls access to the means of production in order to extract tribute from labor. Capitalism is no exception. In this system, the state maintains various kinds of class monopolies, to use Tucker's phrase, to ensure that workers do not receive their natural wage, the full product of their labor. While some of these monopolies are obvious, such as tariffs, state-granted market monopolies, and so on, most are behind the scenes and work to ensure that capitalist domination does not need extensive force to maintain. Under capitalism, there are four major kinds of property, or exploitative monopolies, that the state protects. By enforcing these forms of property, the state ensures that the objective conditions within the economy favor the capitalist, with the worker free only to accept oppressive and exploitative contracts within which they forfeit their autonomy and promise obedience, or face misery and poverty. Due to these initiations of force conducted previously to any specific contract being signed, capitalists enrich themselves at our expense because we, open quote, are compelled to pay a heavy tribute to property holders for the right of cultivating land or putting machinery into action, end quote. These conditions obviously also make a mockery of free agreement. See section B.4. These various forms of state intervention are considered so normal, many people do not even think of them as such. Thus, we find defenders of free market capitalism thundering against forms of state intervention which are designed to aid the poor, while seeing nothing wrong in defending intellectual property rights, corporations, absentee landlords, and the other multitudes of laws and taxes capitalists and their politicians have placed and kept upon the statute books to skew the labor market in favor of themselves. See section F.8 on the state's role in developing capitalism in the first place. Needless to say, despite the supposedly subtle role of such objective pressures in controlling the working class resistance has been such that capital has never been able to dispense with the powers of the state, both direct and indirect. When objective means of control fail, the capitalists will always turn to the use of state repression to restore the natural order. Then, the invisible hand of the market is replaced by the visible fist of the state, and the indirect means of securing ruling class profits and power are supplemented by more direct forms by the state. As we indicate in section D.1, state intervention, beyond enforcing these forms of private property, is the norm of capitalism, not the exception, and is done to secure the power and profits of the capitalist class. To indicate the importance of these state-backed monopolies, we shall sketch their impact. The credit monopoly, by which the state controls who can and cannot issue or loan money, reduces the ability of working-class people to create their own alternatives to capitalism. By charging high amounts of interest on loans, which is only possible because competition is restricted, few people can afford to create cooperatives or one-person firms. In addition, having to repay loans at high interest to capitalist banks ensures that cooperatives often have to undermine their own principles by having to employ wage labor to make ends meet. See section J.5.11. It is unsurprising, therefore, that the very successful Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country created their own credit union, which is largely responsible for the experiment's success. Just as increasing wages is an important struggle within capitalism, so is the question of credit. Proudhon and his followers supported the idea of a people's bank. If the working class could take over and control increasing amounts of money, it could undercut capitalist power while building its own alternative social order. For money is ultimately the means of buying labor power and so authority over the laborer, which is the key to surplus value production. Proudhon hoped that by credit being reduced to cost, namely administration charges, workers would be able to buy the means of production they needed. While most anarchists would argue that increased working class access to credit would no more bring down capitalism than increased wages, All anarchists recognize how more cheap credit, like more wages, can make life easier for working people, and how the struggle for such credit, like the struggle for wages, might play a useful role in the development of the power of the working class within capitalism. Obvious cases that spring to mind are those where money has been used by workers to finance their struggles against capital, from strike funds and weapons to the periodical avoidance of work made possible by sufficiently high money income. Increased access to cheap credit would give working class people slightly more options than selling their liberty or facing misery, just as increased wages and unemployment benefits also gives us more options. Therefore, the credit monopoly reduces competition to capitalism from cooperatives, which are generally more productive than capitalist firms, while at the same time forcing down wages for all workers as the demand for labor is lower than it would be otherwise. This, in turn, allows capitalists to use the fear of the sack to extract higher levels of surplus value from employees, so consolidating capitalist power within and out with the workplace and expansion, increasing setup costs and so creating oligarchic markets dominated by a few firms. In addition, high interest rates transfer income directly from producers to banks. Credit and money are both used as weapons in the class struggle. This is why, again and again, we see the ruling class call for centralized banking and use state action, from the direct regulation of money itself to the attempted management of its flows by the manipulation of the interest, in the face of repeated threats to the nature and role of money within capitalism. The credit monopoly has other advantages for the elite. The 1980s were marked by a rising debt burden on households, as well as the increased concentration of wealth in the US. The two are linked. Due to, open quote, the decline in real hourly wages and the stagnation in household incomes, the middle and lower classes have borrowed more to stay in place, and they have borrowed from the very rich who have become richer, end quote. By 1997, U.S. households spent $1 trillion, or 17% of the after-tax incomes, on debt service, open quote. This represents a massive upward redistribution of income, end quote. And why did they borrow? The bottom 40% of the income distribution, open quote, borrowed to compensate for stagnant or falling incomes, while the upper 20% borrowed mainly to invest. Thus, consumer credit can be thought of as a way to sustain mass consumption in the face of stagnant or falling wages. But there is an additional social and political bonus from the point of view of the creditor class. It reduces pressure for higher wages by allowing people to buy goods they couldn't otherwise afford. It helps to nourish both the appearance and reality of a middle-class standard of living in a time of polarization. And debt can be a great conservatizing force. With a large monthly mortgage and or MasterCard bill, strikes and other forms of troublemaking look less appealing than they would otherwise, end quote. Thus, credit, open quote, is an important form of social coercion. Mortgaged workers are more pliable, end quote. Money is power, and any means which lessens that power by increasing the options of workers is considered a threat by the capitalist class, whether it is tight labor markets, state-provided unemployment benefit, or cheap self-organized credit, will be resisted. The credit monopoly can, therefore, only be fought as part of a broader attack on all forms of capitalist social power. In summary, the credit monopoly, by artificially restricting the option to work for ourselves, ensures we work for a boss while also enriching the few at the expense of the many. The land monopoly consists of enforcement by government of land titles which do not rest upon personal occupancy and use. It also includes making the squatting of abandoned housing and other forms of property illegal. This leads to group rent, by which landlords get payment for letting others use the land they own but do not actually cultivate or use. It also allows the ownership and control of natural resources like oil, gas, coal, and timber. This monopoly is particularly exploitative as the owner cannot claim to have created the land or its resources. It was available to all until the landlord claimed it by fencing it off and barring others from using it. Until the 19th century, the control of land was probably the single most important form of privilege by which working people were forced to accept less than its product as a wage. While this monopoly is less important in a modern capitalist society, as few people know how to farm, it still plays a role, particularly in terms of ownership of natural resources. At a minimum, every home and workplace needs land on which to be built. Thus, while cultivation of land has become less important, the use of land remains crucial. The land monopoly, therefore, ensures that working people find no land to cultivate, no space to set up shop, and no place to sleep without first having to pay a landlord a sum for the privilege of setting foot on the land they own, but neither created nor use. At best, the worker has mortgaged their life for decades to get their wee bit of soil, or, at worst, paid their rent and remained as propertyless as before. Either way, the landlords are richer for the exchange. Moreover, the land monopoly did play an important role in creating capitalism, also see section F.8.3. This took two main forms. Firstly, the state enforced the ownership of large estates in the hands of a single family. Taking the best land by force, these landlords turned vast tracts of land into parks and hunting grounds, so forcing the peasants little option but to huddle together on what remained. Access to superior land was therefore only possible by paying a rent for the privilege, if at all. Thus, an elite claimed ownership of vacant lands, and by controlling access to it without themselves ever directly occupying or working it, they controlled the laboring classes of the time. Secondly, the ruling elite also simply stole land which has traditionally been owned by the community. This was called enclosure, the process by which common land was turned into private property. Economist William Lazanick summarizes this process. Open quote. The reorganization of agricultural land, the enclosure movement, inevitably undermined the viability of traditional peasant agriculture. It created a sizable labor force of disinherited peasants with only tenuous attachments to the land. To earn a living, many of these peasants turned to domestic industry, the production of goods in their cottages. It was the 18th century expansion of domestic industry that laid the basis for the British Industrial Revolution. The emergence of labor-saving machine technology transformed textile manufacture, and the factory replaced the family home as the predominant site of production. End quote. By being able to legally bar people from their property, the landlord class used the land monopoly to ensure the creation of a class of people with nothing to sell but their labor, i.e., liberty. Land was taken from those who traditionally used it, violating common rights, and it was used by the landlord to produce their own profit. More recently, a similar process has been going on in the Third World as well. Personal occupancy was replaced by landlordism and agricultural wage slavery, and so, open quote, the Enclosure Acts reduced the agricultural population to misery, placed them at the mercy of the landowners, and forced a great number of them to migrate to the towns where, as proletarians, they were delivered to the mercy of the middle-class manufacturers. End quote. A variation of this process took place in countries like America, where the state took over ownership of vast tracts of land and then sold it to farmers. As Howard Zinn notes, the Homestead Act, open quote, gave 160 acres of western land, unoccupied and publicly owned, to anyone who would cultivate it for 5 years. Anyone willing to pay $1.25 an acre could buy a homestead. Few ordinary people had the $200 necessary to do this. Speculators moved in and bought up much of the land. End quote. Those farmers who did pay the money often had to go into debt to do so, placing an extra burden on their labor. Vast tracts of land were also given to railroad and other companies either directly, by gift or by selling cheap, in the form of privileged access to state-owned land for the purpose of extracting raw materials like lumber and oil. Either way, access to land was restricted, and those who actually did work it ended up paying a tribute to the landlord in one form or another, either directly in rent or indirectly by repaying a loan. This was the land monopoly in action. Also see sections F.8.3, F.8.4, and F.8.5 for more details. And from it sprang the tools and equipment monopoly, as domestic industry could not survive in the face of industrial capitalism. Confronted with competition from industrial production growing rich on the profits produced from cheap labor, the ability of workers to own their own means of production decreased over time. From a situation where most workers owned their own tools and consequently worked for themselves, we now face an economic regime where the tools and equipment needed for work are owned by capitalists, and consequently, workers now work for a boss. The tools and equipment monopoly is similar to the land monopoly, as it is based upon the capitalist denying workers access to their capital unless the worker pays tribute to the owner for using it. While capital is, open quote, simply stored up labor which has already received its pay in full, and so the lender of capital is entitled to its return intact and nothing more, end quote, to use Tucker's words, due to legal privilege, the capitalist is in a position to charge a fee for its use. This is because, with the working class legally barred from both the land and available capital, the means of life, members of that class have little option but to agree to wage contracts which let capitalists extract a fee for the use of their equipment. See section B.3.2. Thus, the capital monopoly is, like the land monopoly, enforced by the state and its laws. This is most clearly seen if you look at the main form in which such capital is held today, the corporation. This is nothing more than a legal construct. Open quote. Over the last 150 years, notes Joel Bakan, the corporation has risen from relative obscurity to become the world's dominant economic institution. End quote. The law has been changed to give corporations limited liability and other perks in order, open quote, to attract valuable incorporation business by jettisoning unpopular to capitalists restrictions from corporate laws. Finally, the courts fully transformed the corporation onto a person with its own identity and empowered like a real person to conduct business in its own name, acquire assets, employ workers, pay taxes, and go to court to assert its rights and defend its actions. End quote. In America, this was achieved using the 14th Amendment, which was passed to protect freed slaves. In summary, the corporation, open quote, is not an independent person with its own rights, needs, and desires. It is a state-created tool for advancing social and economic policy, end quote. Nor can it be said that this monopoly is the product of hard work and saving. The capital monopoly is a recent development, and how this situation developed is usually ignored. If not glossed over as irrelevant, some fairy tale is spun in which a few bright people saved and worked hard to accumulate capital, and the lazy majority flocked to be employed by these almost superhuman geniuses. In reality, the initial capital for investing in industry came from wealth plundered from overseas or from the proceeds of feudal and landlord exploitation. In addition, as we discuss in section F.8, extensive state intervention was required to create a class of wage workers and ensure that capital was in the best position to exploit them. This explicit state intervention was scaled down once the capital monopoly found its own feet. Once this was achieved, state action became less explicit and becomes focused around defending the capitalists' property rights. This is because the fee charged to workers was partly reinvested into capital, which reduced the prices of goods, ruining domestic industry, and so narrowing the options available to workers in the economy. In addition, investment also increased the setup costs of potential competitors, which continued the dispossession of the working class from the means of production, as these natural barriers to entry into markets ensured few members of that class had the necessary funds to create cooperative workplaces of appropriate size. So while the land monopoly was essential to create capitalism, the tool and equipment monopoly that sprang from it soon became the mainspring of the system. In this way, Usury became self-perpetuating, with apparently free exchanges being the means by which capitalist domination survives. In other words, past initiations of force combined with the current state protection of property ensure that capitalist domination of society continues with only the use of defensive force, i.e., violence used to protect the power of property owners against unions, strikes, occupations, etc. The fees extracted from previous generations of workers has ensured that the current one is in no position to reunite itself with the means of life by free competition. In other words, the paying of usury ensures that usury continues. Needless to say, the surplus produced by this generation will be used to increase the capital stock and so ensure the dispossession of future generations, and so usury becomes self-perpetuating. And of course, state protection of property against theft by working people ensures that property remains theft and the real thieves keep their plunder. As far as the ideas monopoly is concerned, this has been used to enrich capitalist corporations at the expense of the general public and the inventor. Patents make an astronomical price difference. Until the early 1970s, for example, Italy did not recognize drug patents. As a result, Roche products charged the British National Health Service over 40 times more for patented components of Librium and Valium than charged by competitors in Italy. As Tucker argued, the patent monopoly, open quote, consists in protecting investors and authors against competition for a period long enough to enable them to extort from the people a reward enormously in excess of the labor measure of their services. In other words, in giving certain people a right of property for a term of years and facts of nature, and the power to extract tribute from others for the use of this natural wealth which should be open to all. End quote. The net effect of this can be terrible. The Uruguay round of global trade negotiations, open quote, strengthen intellectual property rights. American and other Western drug companies could now stop drug companies in India and Brazil from stealing their intellectual property. But these drug companies in the developing world were making these life-saving drugs available to their citizens at a fraction of the price at which the drugs were sold by the Western drug companies. Profits of the Western drug companies would go up, but the increased profits from sales in the developing world were small, since few could afford the drugs. And so thousands were effectively condemned to death, because governments and individuals in developing countries could no longer pay the high prices demanded. End quote. While international outrage over AIDS drugs eventually forced the drug companies to sell the drugs at cost price in late 2001, the underlying intellectual property rights regime was still in place. The irony that this regime was created in a process allegedly about trade liberalization should not go unnoticed. Open quote. Intellectual property rights, as Noam Chomsky correctly points out, are a protectionist measure. They have nothing to do with free trade. In fact, they're the exact opposite of free trade. End quote. The fundamental injustice of the ideas monopoly is exacerbated by the fact that many of these patented products are the result of government funding of research and development, with private industry simply reaping monopoly profits from technology it did not spend a penny to develop. In fact, extending government aid for research and development is considered an important and acceptable area of state intervention by governments and companies verbally committed to the neoliberal agenda. The ideas monopoly actually works against its own rationale. Patents suppress innovation as much as they encourage it. The research scientists who actually do the work of inventing are required to sign over patent rights as a condition of employment, while patents and industrial security programs used to bolster competitive advantage on the market actually prevent the sharing of information, so reducing innovation. This evil is being particularly felt in universities as the new intellectual property rights regime is spreading there. Further research stalls as the incremental innovation based on others' patents is hindered, while the patent holders can rest on their laurels as they have no fear of a competitor improving the invention. They also hamper technical progress because, by their very nature, preclude the possibility of independent discovery. Also, of course, some companies own a patent explicitly not to use it, but simply to prevent someone else from doing so. As Noam Chomsky notes, today trade agreements like GATT and NAFTA, open quote, impose a mixture of liberalization and protection going far beyond trade, designed to keep wealth and power firmly in the hands of the masters. Thus, investor rights are to be protected and enhanced, and a key demand is increased production for intellectual property, including software and patents, while patent rights extending to process as well as product in order to ensure that US-based corporations control the technology of the future, and so locking the poor majority into dependence on high-priced products of Western agribusiness, biotechnology, the pharmaceutical industry, and so on. End quote. This means that if a company discovers a new, more efficient way of producing a drug, then the ideas monopoly will stop them, and so, open quote, these are not only highly protectionist measures, they're a blow against economic efficiency and technological process. That just shows how much free trade really is involved in all of this, end quote. All of which means that the corporations and their governments in the developed world are trying to prevent emergence of competition by controlling the flow of technology to others. The free trade agreements are being used to create monopolies for their products, and this will either block or slow down the rise of competition. While corporate propagandists piously denounce anti-globalization activists as enemies of the developing world, seeking to use trade barriers to maintain their Western lifestyles at the expense of the poor nations, the reality is different. The ideas monopoly is being aggressively used to either suppress or control the developing world's economic activity in order to keep the South as effectively one big sweatshop. As well as reaping monopoly profits directly, the threat of low-wage competition from the developing world can be used to keep the wage slaves of the developed world in check and so maintain profit levels at home. This is not all. Like other forms of private property, the usury produced by it helps ensure it becomes self-perpetuating. By creating legal absolute monopolies and reaping the excess profits these create, capitalists not only enrich themselves at the expense of others, they also ensure the dominance in the market. Some of the excess profits reaped due to patents and copyrights are invested back into the company, securing advantages by creating various natural barriers to entry for potential competitors. Thus, patents impact on business structure, encouraging the formation and domination of big business. Looking at the end of the 19th century, the ideas monopoly played a key role in promoting cartels and, as a result, laid the foundation for what was to become corporate capitalism in the 20th century. Patents were used on a massive scale to promote concentration of capital, erect barriers to entry, and maintain a monopoly of advanced technology in the hands of Western corporations. The exchange or pooling of patents between competitors historically has been a key method for the creation of cartels in industry. This was true especially of the electrical appliance, communications, and chemical industries. For example, by the 1890s, two large companies, General Electric and Westinghouse, open quote, monopolized a substantial part of the American electrical manufacturing industry, and their success had been in large measure the result of patent control, end quote. The two competitors simply pooled their patents and, open quote, yet another means of patent and market control had developed, corporate patent pooling agreements. Designed to minimize the expense and uncertainties of conflict between the giants, they greatly reinforced the position of each vis-à-vis lesser competitors and new entrants into the field, end quote. While the patent system is, in theory, promoted to defend the small-scale inventor, in reality, it is corporate interests that benefit. As David Noble points out, the, open quote, inventor, the original focus of the patent system, tended to increasingly abandon his patent in exchange for corporate security. He either sold or licensed his patent rights to industrial corporations or assigned them to the company of which he became an employee, bartering his genius for a salary. In addition, by means of patent control gained through purchase, consolidation, patent tools, and cross-licensing agreements, as well as by regulated patent production through systematic industrial research, the corporations steadily expanded their monopoly of monopolies. As well as this, corporations used patents to circumvent antitrust laws. This reaping of monopoly profits at the expense of the customer made such tremendous strides between 1900 and 1929 and, open quote, were of such proportions as to render subsequent judicial and legislative effects to check corporate monopoly through patent control too little too late, end quote. Things have changed little since Edwin Prindle, a corporate patent lawyer, wrote in 1906 that, open quote, patents are the best and most effective means of controlling competition. They occasionally give absolute command of the market, enabling their owner to name the price without regard to the cost of production. Patents are the only legal form of absolute monopoly. The power which a patentee has to dictate the conditions under which his monopoly may be exercised had been used to form trade agreements throughout practically entire industries, end quote. Thus, the ruling class, by means of the state, is continually trying to develop new forms of private property by creating artificial scarcities and monopolies. For example, by requiring expensive licenses to engage in particular types of activities, such as broadcasting or producing certain kinds of medicines or products. In the information age, usury, use fees, from intellectual property are becoming a much more important source of income for elites, as reflected in the attention paid to strengthening mechanisms for enforcing copyright and patents in the recent GATT agreements, or in U.S. pressure on foreign countries like China to respect such laws. This allows corporations to destroy potential competitors and ensure that their prices can be set as high as possible, and monopoly profits maintained indefinitely. It also allows them to enclose ever more of the common inheritance of humanity, place it under private ownership, and charge the previous users money to gain access to it. As Chomsky notes, open quote, U.S. corporations must control seeds, plant varieties, drugs, and the means of life generally, end quote. This has been termed biopiracy. A better term may be the new enclosures, and it is a process by which, open quote, international companies are patenting traditional medicines or foods, end quote. They, open quote, seek to make money from resources and knowledge that rightfully belongs to the developing countries, and in so doing, they squelch domestic firms that have long provided the products. While it is not clear whether these patents would hold up in court if they were effectively challenged, it is clear that the less developed countries may not have the legal and financial resources required to challenge the patent, end quote. They may also not withstand the economic pressures they may experience if the international markets conclude that such acts indicate a regime that is less than business friendly. That the people who were dependent on the generic drugs or plants can no longer afford them is as irrelevant as the impediments to scientific and technological advance they create. In other words, capitalists desire to skew the free market in their favor by ensuring that the law reflects and protects their interests, namely their property rights. By this process, they ensure that cooperative tendencies within society are crushed by state-supported market forces. As Noam Chomsky puts it, modern capitalism is, open quote, state protection and public subsidy for the rich, market discipline for the poor, end quote. Self-proclaimed defenders of free market capitalism are usually nothing of the kind, while the few who actually support it only object to the public subsidy aspect of modern capitalism and happily support state protection for property rights. All these monopolies seek to enrich the capitalist and increase their capital stock at the expense of working people, to restrict their ability to undermine the ruling elite's power and wealth. All aim to ensure that any option we have to work for ourselves, either individually or collectively, is restricted by tilting the playing field against us, making sure that we have little option but to sell our labor on the free market and be exploited. In other words, the various monopolies make sure that natural barriers to entry, see section C.4, are created, leaving the heights of the economy in the control of big business, while alternatives to capitalism are marginalized at its fringes. So it is these kinds of property and the authoritarian social relationships that they create which the state exists to protect. It should be noted that converting private to state ownership, i.e. nationalization, does not fundamentally change the nature of property relationships. It just removes private capitalists and replaces them with bureaucrats, as we discuss in section B.3.5.